Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Moin Robani. Good morning, good afternoon, Moin. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you, Nassim. Always a pleasure to be with you.
And we want to begin this week with the big story from last Wednesday, the killing of Yahya Sinwar. So we're spending a lot of time on that. I want to get your thoughts on various aspects of his killing. Then we'll move to the situation in northern Gaza, where Israel seems to be executing what many have described as an eradication plan.
Mhm.
Of course, we are seeing death toll every single day. So we'll speak about northern Gaza and then move on to some of the broader issues, including the situation in with regards to the International Criminal Court. There's a story which I want to discuss with that and probably get an update on the ICC situation as well. But let's begin with the assassination of Yahya Sinwar. Basically, your general comments. He was killed on Wednesday, 16 October. Initially, it was presumed to be from a tank fire. Now it turns out from an autopsy report that he was actually shot on the head, and that was the fatal shot that killed him. So it wasn't the tank fire as was initially claimed. So let's begin with your initial comments on that, and then we'll discuss some of the other aspects of his killing.
Sure. Well, actually, we don't know how he died because we do know that the Israeli military spokesperson has a habit of distorting autopsy reports. So he may well have been killed by a bullet to the head. He may have been killed by tank fire. And given that a video was released showing him basically in military fatigues and fighting until his last breath, the Israelis may have determined that it would be in their interest to claim that he was killed by a shot from an Israeli soldier rather than from a tank round fired from afar. So I would say the jury is still out on that. Regarding his killing, I think there are several aspects. First of all, I think he was a very consequential leader for Hamas. But unlike, for example, the Hezbollah General Secretary Hassan Nasrallah, who led that movement for more than 3 decades, or Yasser Arafat, who led the Fatah movement for almost half a century, uh, Sinwar had only been the titular leader of Hamas for a few months. Had He had been a long-standing member, but really the time period in which he was an important and influential leader on the ground with an operational role, if you will, only began during the past decade when he was released from several decades behind Israeli bars as part of a prisoner exchange. So I don't think that his removal from Hamas and from Hamas's leadership will have as important an effect on the organization as some of these others we're talking. Certainly not, for example, of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founding leader of Hamas. Having said that, he did prove to be enormously consequential during the past several years, both in reorienting Hamas away from strict adherence to Muslim Brotherhood line and diversification of its alliances. So he repaired. I think it was him who took the lead in repairing Hamas's relations with Egypt and Iran, seeking to restore relations with Syria, strengthening relations with the axis of resistance, but also others, because I think it was he, perhaps more than any other Hamas leader, who put forward the view that Hamas's relations should be based on the movement's needs and interests rather than strictly on the basis of its ideological preferences. Secondly, of course, he has been widely believed to have been a chief architect of Hamas's offensive into southern Israel and the attacks of October 7th of last year. I think we shouldn't jump to conclusions because we don't know if his role was actually in planning these operations or in authorizing them to be planned and implemented by others. For example, Hamas's military commander, Mohammed Deif. But clearly, they would not have been launched without his consent and approval and participation. And I think, the line that he has pursued during the past year of direct confrontation with Israel, of refusing any settlement that does not meet the minimum demands of an end to this war, of a comprehensive Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and of a meaningful exchange of captives with Israel, in which senior Palestinian detainees are released from Israeli incarceration. I don't see that Hamas is going to change its line on these issues just because he has been killed. And lastly, I think he's in death. He has already achieved iconic status, legendary status, however you want to put it, because of course the Israeli line, parroted by its stenographers in the Western media during the past year, is that this is someone who was cowering in tunnels, hiding like a coward while his people were being slaughtered, moving around in women's clothes, surrounding himself with helpless Israeli hostages so that the Israelis would not be able to take him out. I mean, it was always a little questionable, if Israel knew all of this about him, how come they could never locate him? If they knew he was in a tunnel, they knew he was surrounded by hostages, they knew where he was moving, they knew which city he was in because they were constantly giving us updates. But now it's clear they had absolutely no clue. And in fact, his killing was not an assassination. It was not a pre-planned operation in which they knew who he was and where he was and went in to kill him. To the contrary, it was above ground. He was armed. He was wearing military fatigues. And by the looks of it, it was he and those who were with him who initiated the confrontation. And ultimately, we've all seen the videos of his kind of final act of defiance of throwing a stick at a drone that came in either to view or kill him. But it presents, I think, more than just a very different picture of that which we have been spoon-fed by the Western media based on unfounded Israeli allegations that were never challenged, I should add. It directly contradicts them. But of course, we've seen no mea culpa from the Western media. Where now, the obituaries, for example, refer to him being known as the butcher of Khan Yunis. Well, among Palestinians, he was never known as the butcher of Khan Yunis, including among people who detested him. So, once again, Israel puts forward a particular narrative. It's picked up uncritically and circulated by its stenographers in the mainstream Western media, and it's up to us to kind of separate truth from fiction.
I'm glad you began with pointing out the contradiction within the Israeli narrative, because, as I mentioned, first the reports were that he was killed by a tank fire. Then the New York Times reported an Israeli doctor saying that he was shot on the head. And I presume, as you mentioned, that the contradiction is really as a result of Israel trying to get control of the narrative, because he has become a kind of a martyr. If you look at the social media post, and he seems to be celebrated.
Yes, and among a much wider group of people than those who supported him in life, I should add, because of the manner of his death. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but also, it's a little unclear why the Israelis released those videos and images of his final moments. I think it was probably to satisfy the bloodlust of of their own constituents. But in doing so, they have effectively created a folk hero. Perhaps they wanted to show he's dead and we killed him. But of course, what the world saw, and not only his supporters, is someone acting in direct contradiction to what had been said about him, and as someone who was defiant until his last breath.
And what I was getting to is the American position. Quickly, soon after his killing, they came out and said that they had been sharing intelligence with the Israelis as though they played a part in killing Yahya Sinwar. It turns out it was nothing of the sort. It wasn't an assassination attempt. This was initially it was a random firefight between what Israelis thought were Palestinian resistance fighters, and they weren't aware of the fact that it was Sinwar. So the Americans coming out as quickly as they did, pretending as though this was some great operation, that they shared intelligence with the Israelis. And now it seems like, again, their narrative is also collapsing, and the Israeli narrative is collapsing. So, how does that make the Americans look with regards to the killing of Sinwar as well?
Well, to a certain extent, I think it does make the Americans look complicit because they didn't actually claim that they had a hand in this confrontation in which Sinwar was killed. What the Americans have been saying, and it's entirely truthful, is that they have been assisting Israel with the full gamut of their intelligence resources since the 7th of October of last year to help the Israelis locate Sinwar and other Hamas leaders. We know the British have been doing the same. We know the Germans have been doing the same. And basically, it consists of two elements, according to people who've looked into this. One of which is that these Western states have superior capabilities in terms of ground penetrating radar and so on compared to their Israeli proxy. And secondly, Israel does not have the resources to cover every square millimeter of the Gaza Strip on a 24/7 basis. So with the assistance of for example, British drones flying out of Cyprus, American drones, and so on, Israel has been able to obtain full coverage of the Gaza Strip on a 24/7 basis for over a year now. And the question that raises itself is not so much whether the United States and its allies were involved in the killing of Sinwar, but I think more importantly, to what extent has their intelligence been used, and to what extent has their intelligence been knowingly used, and to what extent have they knowingly participated in targeting operations that are quite clearly genocidal in character and in implementation. I think that's the much more fundamental question that needs to be asked now. But of course, rather than this question being posed, and rather than the United States and other Western states being challenged on what appears to be direct participation in a genocidal campaign against a civilian population, we're just getting stories about, advanced technology and partnership with a close ally and all the rest of it.
I mean, I was going to ask him, who do you think will replace him? I don't think it's really that important given so many Hamas leaders have been assassinated over the years, and the organization has thrived and flourished, and no assassination has stopped its resistance. So,
Well,
said I should sorry.
yeah, I do think it's a question worth addressing for two reasons. The first will be to see whether Hamas chooses a new leader and publicizes the name of that leader, or whether it establishes more of a leadership committee for the current phase. If it's a single leader, it may be someone like Azat al-Rishq or Khalil Haya. I really have no clue. But the second issue is whether the new leader will be based in exile, in other words, part of the Hamas exile leadership, which is primarily based in Qatar, or whether it will be another figure within the Gaza Strip. But in either case, as some analysts have suggested, the ultimate decisions are going to continue to be made by the field leadership in the Gaza Strip. In other words, if the leadership in exile were to agree to things that the leadership within the Gaza Strip does not accept because it does not meet the movement's minimum demands, the exiled leadership, regardless of how much pressure it comes under from the Egyptian and Qatari mediators, will not accept it.
Hmm. Do you reckon his killing will present an off-ramp at least for Washington, if not for Israel? Because Israel, I mean, I think we can safely presume that the war isn't really against Hamas, it's really a war against the Palestinians and the existence of Palestinians. I think we can say that without any doubt. But at least for Washington, do you think this presents an off-ramp, which Biden has been seeking all these months, not least because there's an election coming up and he doesn't want to be seen to be escalating or allowing Israel to commit further genocide?
I don't. I was speaking to a very well-informed U.S. journalist over the summer, and he put forward the theory that one reason the U.S. was so deeply involved in the hunt for Sinwar was because the U.S. hoped that if Israel was able to successfully assassinate Sinwar, it could effectively declare victory and go home. I think that may well have been the case several months ago, but I think the situation has completely changed since then because in recent months, of course, Israel has assassinated not only Sinwar's predecessor, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran, but also virtually the entire senior military leadership of Hezbollah, the Hezbollah General Secretary, Hassan Nasrallah, and various others. And Israel is now engaged in what appears to be a very determined campaign to seek to dismantle the coalition known as the Axis of Resistance. And I think the change in the U.S. position in recent months has been that it shares in Israel's growing confidence that this is an objective that can be achieved and is therefore not going to make any effort to bring the genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip to a halt. It's basically partially subcontracted its war objectives to Israel, completely shares in them, and is moving additional assets and even putting its own armed forces in harm's way in order to ensure that Israel achieves significant objectives.
So do you think, if that is the case, do you think that goes somewhere to explaining why Israel has adopted the policy it has with regards to northern Gaza? It's completely decimated northern Gaza, and it seems to be, we spoke about this last week, that Israel is implementing what is known as the General's Plan. We speak referring to Gilad Eiland, who is the retired Major General of the Israeli Defense Forces. So do you think the Americans have basically given a green light and accepted the fact that Israel will have to occupy northern Gaza in some shape or form, and therefore the whole of northern Gaza, as we are saying, is being decimated every single day. We're seeing death tolls. Yesterday, I think it was something like 87 or 90 Palestinians that were killed. And we're also seeing in Israel, Likud leaders organizing events and conferences about the resettlement of Gaza. Key ministers from Benjamin Netanyahu's government took part in an initiative to resettle northern Gaza. So it seems. So do you think the Americans have kind of bought into that plan? Northern Gaza seems to be decimated. Israel will take control of that, it seems like, in some shape or form, which is why it's forcing, ethnically cleansing Palestinians out of northern Gaza. So do you think the Americans have bought into that plan?
My sense is that Gaza isn't really on the U.S. agenda anymore, one way or the other. They have really no interest in either pursuing a ceasefire or not pursuing one. I think Washington feels that it has much bigger fish to fry, even if it costs Kamala Harris the election in a few weeks. My sense is that the U.S. attitude is that Israel can and should do as it pleases in the Gaza Strip, while Washington is now primarily focused on the much broader picture of seeking to weaken, perhaps even dismantle the axis of resistance by seeking to deal a mortal blow to Hezbollah in Lebanon, by continuing to attack Ansarullah in Yemen, and ultimately preparing for a very likely direct confrontation with Iran. And, the lives of several 100,000 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, particularly in its north, hold about as much value as did the lives of Iraqis or Vietnamese or others subjected to the tender mercy of the U.S. in recent decades. Now, regarding what's going on in the northern Gaza Strip, it's really developed from a war of annihilation into a war of extermination. I really think there's absolutely no other way to describe it. As you mentioned, Israel's strategy has been to divide the Gaza Strip in two, basically northern Gaza, the area north of what Israel calls a Netzarim corridor, and the area south. It has now systematically deprived the several 100,000 Palestinians north of that corridor of water, of food, of medical supplies, of fuel, of electricity, all the rest of it. And it's also seeking to shut off telecommunications. It is constantly and systematically bombing this area, basically going after anything that moves. It's bombing hospitals, it's sniping children in the streets, and then bombing those who seek to come to their aid. It's bombing shelters. It's really reminiscent of some of the most depraved atrocities that we're familiar with from the past century. And of course, if you look at the international response to this, or rather, I should say, the Western response, it's being presented as legitimate self-defense by Israel. In other words, genocide has now graduated from the crime of crimes, a crime that can never be justified under any circumstances, to a legitimate form of self-defense. And I think the most telling comment in this respect was by the German foreign minister a few days ago, Annalena Baerbock, if I remember her name
Yes, that's right.
correctly, in which she was very clear what Israel is doing in northern Gaza is self-defense. Self-defense means not only defeating Hamas, but destroying it. And it's entirely legitimate to attack civilians in its efforts to do so. She, of course, made completely unsubstantiated claims that Hamas is hiding behind these civilians. But basically, if you look up her comment, which has been all over the media, she's the leader of the Green Party. And this is a statement that could just as easily have been made with the same conviction, using the same words, by any leader of the German National Socialist Party in the 1940s. There really is absolutely no distinction between what the leader of the German Green Party has said about Palestinians in the Gaza Strip last week and the necessity of mass murder of civilians on the one hand, and what German Nazi leaders were saying in the 1940s, some of whom may well have been her forebears, I don't know, were saying about Jews and Slavs and others in Europe during the 1940s. Absolutely no distinction.
Yeah, and good you mentioned that. But I want to just point out that while Annalena Baerbock said what she said, was supporting Israel's right to what she calls self-defense in northern Gaza, even though Israel has been killing civilians. There has been some response from Israel's Western allies, beginning with France. Emmanuel Macron, he banned Israeli companies from showing up in a arms festival in France during November. So in response, Israeli senior politicians are seeking to punish Macron or take legal action against Macron. And here in the UK, the Labour government has gone after some of the low-hanging fruits, which is to announce sanctions against 7 organizations promoting Israeli settlements, illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank.
Yes.
So yeah, it seems like they want to do something, but their hands, for some reason, is constrained, and they are just going after some of the really, really low-hanging fruits, which is settlements and banning Israeli companies from taking part in arms affair. But that seems to be still symbolically a good position.
Yes, I mean, what you call low-hanging fruit, I would call a charade or smoke and mirrors. Given that France is the state that was Israel's primary arms supplier during the 1960s, and that Israel won the June 1967 war primarily on the strength of French weaponry. Given that the European Union is the one institution more than any other that has made Israel's settlement enterprise a viable proposition by opening its markets to illegal settlement products and welcoming them, and often even giving them the same trade privileges that it gives to products exported from within Israel's internationally recognized borders. To now take these kind of piecemeal measures is really entirely meaningless. Banning Israel from an arms fair, well, of course it's a correct decision, but becomes virtually invisible when measured against all the other measures that France has been taking, either in active support of Israel or in what amounts to passive acquiescence to its policies and its genocide currently in the Gaza Strip. The same, of course, goes for the United Kingdom. Sanctioning a few individual settlers and settler organizations. It took them 60 years to do this, by the way. The settlement enterprise began in 1967, and it's only in 2023, 2024, that it occurred to the government of Great Britain to begin sanctioning some of these criminals. And of course, for decades, it has been sanctioning Palestinians left and right. It's now persecuting British journalists under anti-terrorism legislation who are investigating Britain's role in the genocide in the Gaza Strip and so on. So it's quite clear that as a whole, Europe is much more disturbed by Palestinian resistance, much more disturbed by opposition of their own citizens to what Israel is doing than it is disturbed by the crimes being committed by Israel. Let's not forget, we're here talking about states that openly celebrated Israel's 1967 June war victory, openly celebrated a war that Israel initiated, that led to the occupation of the remainder of mandatory Palestine, which they have been quite comfortable with now for 6 decades. So, to come in the 2020s and finally sanction a settler here and participation in an arms fair there is really, again, a charade. It's smoke and mirrors. But having said that, France is a sovereign state, and perhaps Israel's foreign minister, Katz, doesn't understand the distinction between France and the Gaza Strip, and perhaps now, I don't know, maybe wants to launch an invasion of France because his weapons exporters are banned from an arms fair. That's up to him.
Yeah. Let's look at some of the regional response regarding the killing of Yahya Sinwar. And I wanted to focus on Saudi Arabia in particular, one story that's come out from there. We spoke a little bit about the cult of martyrdom that's been shared and expressed throughout social media. And there was a report that that Saudi regulators have ordered an investigation into MBC, which is the largest Middle Eastern media organization,
Middle
and
East
they.
Broadcasting
So yes,
Corporation.
that's right. And then they broadcast a report describing Sinwar as a new face of terrorism. And I thought that's quite an interesting development, the fact that they wanted to get to the bottom of how Sinwar was described in that manner by NBC. And then I looked at some of the stats regarding the opposition to Israel and general sentiment on the Arab street regarding Israel's genocide in Gaza. And I got these figures from the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. And from that poll, it shows that 94% viewed the US position negatively. Their position on the US hardened since the launch of the Gaza invasion. 5% of Arab Street said that the attack on 7 October was illegitimate. Only 5% said that. 92% expressed solidarity with the Palestinians, and there seems to be almost unanimous consensus within the Arab streets and population with regards to their support for the Palestinians. So it seems like even dictators and autocrats have to be now mindful of the popular view on the streets. Yes, what do you make of the fact that even Saudi Arabia, who ostensibly is seeking normalization and seeking to sign the Abraham Accords, is pushing back against the description of Yahya Sinwar as the new face of terrorism?
Well, of course, all leaders have to take public opinion into account. And in Saudi Arabia or other Middle East autocracies or dictatorships, no less than the West. And kind of this idea we have that what distinguishes Western democracies is that their policies are determined by public opinion. It's a a bit of a hoax. I mean, if you look at how public opinion views the current crisis versus how governments are conducting themselves, it's quite clear they couldn't care less about public opinion and have absolutely no intention, with very few exceptions, of following it. I mean, you go to the US, it's not ballots that determine policies, it's dollars, it's a plutocracy. And in Europe, it's I don't really think one can meaningfully argue that governments formulate foreign policy on the basis of the preferences of their public opinion. But to get back to your question, I think there's several issues here. Those polls you mentioned reflect the views of Arab public opinion now in late October
That's
of
right.
2024, after more than a year of what people have been witnessing on their television screens and on their social media on a daily basis now for more than a year. And if you want to get an indication of how this is changing things, look at Oman, a state that has had, on the whole, cordial relations with across the board, with both Iran and Israel and so on. Netanyahu visited some years ago. There's been a change of leadership there recently. Not a state that is particularly known for being welcoming to more militant groups in the Middle East. But they had a newspaper headline there, an entire front page, with pictures of images of Sinwar, Nasrallah, and Hania, with a caption that was tantamount to "Glory to our martyrs." You look at Saudi Arabia, which has the largest and arguably the most engaged public opinion in the Arabian Peninsula. What happened here was that the Saudi and Emirati media have really been parroting Israeli propaganda now for the better part of a year. And they have been constantly denouncing Israel's enemies as terrorists. And at one point, this went too far for some of the more militant Shia groups in Iraq, and they went and ransacked, I think, the embassy office in Baghdad. And it's in that context that these developments have taken place. But looking also at Saudi Arabia specifically, you mentioned that it was negotiating with the Biden administration about a potential normalization agreement with Israel on the eve of October the 7th. That's no longer the case. I think Saudi Arabia, and not only Saudi Arabia, now view Israel as a completely unreliable partner, as one that is determined to expand and escalate conflict throughout the Middle East in a way that, rather than defending them against a potential Iranian threat, is going to expose them to an Iranian threat. And so I think even at state level, at the level of the rulers of these countries, they've become much more wary of Israel than they were a year ago. And one sign of this, of course, is that they held a collective meeting with the Iranian foreign minister earlier this month, because they, I think, are seeking to improve their relations with Tehran in order to ensure that they remain immune to any confrontation that they expect to develop between Israel and Iran, potentially with U.S. participation.
It is worth pointing out that the treaties and the so-called Abraham Accord, these are all pretty much transactional. If Saudis and the Gulf countries can't find another state to provide the same transaction, then why? There is no ideological commitment to the American and the Zionist project. It's just politically, they're the only ones who can guarantee safety. But as you said, seeing what's been happening over the past year, the genocide, and also there's been a lot of discussion about Greater Israel and what that could mean for some of the Gulf countries. And I think they're listening to some of the rhetoric coming out from Israel, the emboldened far-right extremists. Can the Saudis and the Emiratis work with what seems to be irremovable far-right extremist government in Tel Aviv? I don't think even they can be seen to be working with these extremist settlers.
Yes, well, the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is reported to have stated to, I believe, a U.S. official he met with, something along the lines of, "I don't care about the Palestinians, but my people do." I don't know if that was an accurate report or propaganda, but I think it reflects the realities in the region today, that these rulers and governments would like to maintain a position of studied indifference, but they are no longer in a position where they can move forward with closer relations with Israel, because, just because they're not parliamentary democracies doesn't mean public opinion is irrelevant to them. I would make a potential exception for the United Arab Emirates. And there, the leadership, I think, is ideologically invested in Greater Israel. It is ideologically invested in the Zionist project, and it wants to maintain its status as kind of the pioneer among Arab states, and not only signing a normalization agreement with Israel, as others have done before it, Egypt, Jordan, the PLO, but as one that has fully and unconditionally embraced Israel, irrespective of what Israel does, as one that is seeking to consistently deepen its ties and relations with Israel, whether in the economic or trade or security or whatever sector, and wants to maintain its status so that it can maintain, the recognition by the U.S. That it is a UAE more than any other state that has rushed to embrace and normalize Israel as it currently exists, rather than the Israel that the Arab states generally have proposed. This, of course, Emirati public opinion takes a rather different view, but I think the Emirati leadership is sufficiently confident in the ability of its own security services, ably assisted by the Israeli security services, to be able to suppress its own public opinion in this respect. But even then, it's entirely possible that we could reach a stage where even this Emirati leadership will feel that its current course has become untenable and will undertake perhaps, symbolic or more substantive measures, again, in order to insulate itself from the regional fallout of what its close Israeli ally is doing throughout the region.
There's been some interesting development with Israel's escalation with Lebanon and Iran. So I just want to get your thoughts on that, beginning with the Israeli claim that Hezbollah targeted Netanyahu's house. Apparently, they tried to assassinate him. That's what the Israelis are claiming. And in response, Netanyahu said the attempt by Iran's proxy Hezbollah to assassinate me and my wife today was a grave mistake. Um, uh, Added to that, reports in Washington that the White House is investigating an unauthorized release of classified document that assesses Israel's plan to attack Iran. So now, based on that, there's all kind of speculation as to who could have been behind the leak of the Israeli plan, from Iranian hackers into US intelligence to even one analyst claiming that the Biden administration may have orchestrated the leak itself in order to delay the Israeli attack after the election, something along that line. So it seems to be, given what Netanyahu said with response to the Hezbollah attack on his house, allegedly, that he's priming the West and his allies for a massive assault on Iran. That seems to be what I read from his comments, but also speak to that and also the development in Washington, the leaked plan of the Israelis. And I found that quite strange.
Well, it's a little ironic that Israel, which has developed a deserved reputation for assassinations throughout the region, throughout the world, of its adversaries, is now getting all high and mighty over an assassination attempt on one of its own leaders. And according to Israeli press reports, Israel has sent an indirect message to Hezbollah that if there is another assassination attempt on a senior Israeli official, it will reduce the entirety of the Dahya, the southern suburbs of Beirut, to rubble, or perhaps more accurately, what hasn't been reduced to rubble already. And the Israelis have also said that they've basically tried to paint this as an Iranian operation rather than one by Hezbollah. And the Israeli statements have also indicated that they will take this assassination attempt into consideration as they formulate their upcoming attack on Iran. So clearly, Israel is anticipating that it will be able to conduct more assassinations in Tehran, in addition to the very many that it has already carried out there in recent decades. I think, given that Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, just a few days ago said that Israel has already defeated Hezbollah and is now in the process of eradicating it or destroying it. It bears looking into in some detail. Israel, like arguably any conventional army, fights by seeking to strike a immediate fatal blow against its enemy. That's what we saw in July, August, September. Hezbollah has taken a very different approach, which is seeking to weaken its adversary, which is a state, but through a war of attrition, which escalates gradually. In other words, to put it crudely, is saving the best for last. It wants to prolong this conflict rather than shorten it because it believes that Israel will be in a much weaker position in terms of the economic, the military, the reputational costs that will be incurred by a longer conflict. And, it was after Israel repeatedly declared victory that Hezbollah was first able to send this drone into the canteen of a Golani brigade base in between Haifa and Tel Aviv and Binyamina, which apparently one of an owner of a nearby cafe said he didn't even know that this space existed. So that's how good Hezbollah's intelligence was. And now it was able to launch a drone directly into Netanyahu's living room, even though he wasn't there at the time. So quite clearly, all the reports that we have been hearing recent months about, 50% of Hezbollah's capabilities, 75% of Hezbollah's capabilities, 250% of Hezbollah's capabilities being eliminated, all again dutifully reported by Israel stenographers in the Western press, are based on nothing with the exception of hot air. Just as we never learned to take Israeli pronouncements about the Gaza Strip with a grain of salt. So it appears we're never going to learn not to take Israel's claims about Lebanon and Hezbollah seriously unless and until proven otherwise. But it clearly shows, Hezbollah is launching apparently greater numbers of rockets deeper into Israel with every passing day. There are consistent confrontations on the Israeli-Lebanese border. I think it was only today that Israel, for the first time, managed to enter one of the border villages. So quite clearly, reality and what we're being told are not only two very different things, but arguably two entirely contradictory things. Regarding these allegedly
Leaks.
leaked documents, yes, it's two things I think are unclear. Whether the documents are genuine, and people who are familiar with such documents are suggesting that either these documents are genuine or whoever faked them knew exactly what they were doing because they were written in the same style and so on. And secondly, how they came into circulation. Were they leaked by someone in the US intelligence community because they wanted to raise an alarm about potentially the US armed forces being in harm's way because they're being led by the nose by Israel? Was it the product of a hack by Iran or one of its allies? So those two questions remain unanswered. But either way, I think they add to this expectation that an Israeli attack on Iran is imminent. And I don't think there's any serious analyst who does not expect it to be conducted either within the next few weeks, but certainly no later than immediately after the US presidential election. And secondly, I think we also should take Iranian statements seriously that unlike in April, where they were not prepared to escalate further and decided not to respond to what was a limited Israeli attack on Iran. This time, their red line is any violation of Iranian sovereignty. And if this red line is crossed, not only will they respond, but their retaliation will be even more severe than their previous one. And, one could argue that the Iranians are bluffing because they've said, they've made statements such as attacking oil facilities throughout the Gulf if Iranian oil facilities are hit and the rest of it. I'm sure some of it is bluff, but at the end of the day, I think the Iranians have concluded that the price of inaction has become unbearably higher than the cost of taking a firm position against Israeli attacks on Iranian soil.
It is worth pointing out, I guess, the same camp that said that Iraq in 2003 would be cakewalk, the same Zionists, same neocons, same pro-Israeli officials are now saying, they were wrong about Iraq. They said it would be a cakewalk. They're the ones who are now cheerleading the attack on Iran. So I don't
Yes,
know
and it's
why.
worth pointing out that one of the biggest cheerleaders in 2002, 2003 was none other than Benjamin Netanyahu, who said an invasion of Iraq would be extraordinarily successful, would change the face of the Middle East for the better when seen from the perspective of US and Israeli interests, and probably now harbors very similar illusions about attacking Iran and the consequences this will have.
Mm. And one analyst pointed out Iran would be a completely different matter altogether because whereas in the case of Iraq, you had more or less the support of the Gulf countries, but with
And
Iran, it's
Iran.
complete. Yeah, and Iran. But in this case, the US and Israel would be more or less executing this war by themselves and risking Saudi's national security and all the other Gulf countries, their national security as well. So it's a completely different ball game altogether. I want to end on something we haven't spoken of for a long time, which is the situation at the International Criminal Court. Everyone's people have been expecting, waiting to see what the ICC will do. I think it was in May. I think it was May, yeah, when the ICC chief prosecutor Karim
Yes.
Khan sought arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant and Hamas leaders as well, two of whom or three of whom have already been killed already, I think. Um, but the story here is everyone had the suspicion why the ICC is not moving on this issue. We can guess that it's to do with the pressure that's been applied from Washington and elsewhere. And also, there seems to be a campaign to discredit and smear Karim Khan. And that's a story related to uh, Khan allegedly harassing a female colleague. The alleged victim decided against making a formal complaint, but that suggests to me that Israel is pulling out all the cards, like it did with Fatou Bensouda, who's the predecessor of Karim Khan.
Yes.
She was the victim or subject of spying, hacking, intimidation, which we spoke about in this program back in May as well.
Attempted bribery. Yep.
Attempted bribery as well. So yeah, what do you think that is what's happening behind the scene and explains why there's delay in the ICC moving on the arrest warrant request by Karim Khan?
I think it's indisputable that there's a lot happening behind the scene, and given these latest allegations against the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan, it's quite clear they should either be dismissed for being false allegations, or they should be taken seriously, in which case the ICC's Assembly of State Parties should immediately convene, remove Khan from his position, and replace him with another prosecutor, and hopefully one that is a little more competent and a little more dedicated to the rule of law, including following the Rome Statute, which governs the operations of the ICC. But I don't think this pressure and intimidation and so on is really the story here. I think the real story is that the ICC itself, and particularly the prosecutor, Karim Khan, and the three judges who comprise the so-called pre-trial chamber, the body that has to approve any application for a warrant for arrest by the prosecutor. I think the real problem is they don't want to do their jobs. They do not want to move ahead with this. They view themselves as defenders of the West's interests. They do not view themselves as kind of blindfolded Lady Justice, dishing out justice without fear or favor to friend and foe alike. It goes against their very being to have to indict and prosecute a Western proxy like Benjamin Netanyahu. If it was up to them, they would spend 95% of their time going after Africans and the remaining 5% going after enemies of the West, like Russia's Putin. It took, I believe, the pretrial chamber something like 2 weeks to issue an arrest warrant for a head of state of a permanent member of the Security Council, a nuclear state, the largest state on the planet. But it's taken them 5 months to make up their minds about Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. There's only one explanation. They don't want to do this. That's why Khan in May publicized his application for an arrest warrant. Very unusual for the prosecutor to do this. And what it created is a process of several months during which a variety of objections and hearings and whatnot could be held. We're now 5 months further, and it seems that the ICC is no closer to a decision than it was in May. Whatever they end up doing, it's quite clear that if it was up to them, this case would have never started. And we need to also bear in mind these applications for arrest warrants relate only to the conduct of two Israeli leaders in the Gaza Strip since October 2023, even though an investigation has been ongoing since 2021, which encompasses Israeli conduct in not only the Gaza Strip, but also the West Bank and East Jerusalem since June of 2014. So the backlog is immense. And I think, well, obviously it would be a good thing for these arrest warrants to be issued. It's only a very small part of the story compared to all the other crimes against humanity and war crimes and crimes of aggression and crimes of genocide as defined by the Rome Statute, going back to June of 2014, that the ICC prosecutor should be seeking hundreds, if not thousands, of arrest warrants for.
I hope next time we speak about the ICC, it is discussing the ICC approving the request for arrest warrants. I hope that is the case.
It's entirely possible, but again, I think their instinct is to do nothing. Their preference is inertia. But having said that, if it were not for the extraordinary pressure from not only global public opinion, not only from the legal community, but also even from the members of the ICC itself, a number of Latin American governments, South Africa, Malaysia, I believe, and a few others. It's only because of this growing pressure that the ICC has acted at all.
Thank you, Moin. That was my weekly guest, Moin Rabbani, joining me, Nasim Ahmed, for our weekly review show. See you again soon, Moin, and see you also. And thank you for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nasim.